Hello, everyone. Um, Recently, a virtue signaling bien-pensant um, Lebanese fellow, very worldly, urbane, cosmopolitan um fellow with a very impressive, really, world of references and knowledge areas. He posted on my Twitter a comment essentially mocking the Maronites and Maronites' myths of origin, likening them to the abominated parochialisms of primitives in a world where it has become stylish and righteous to dismiss identity and memory as modern forms of racism and Islamophobia. So I'd like to begin in my response by saying that, incidentally, the very concepts of anti-parochialism, if you will, so it's in the Middle East, generally speaking, but Lebanon particularly, the very concepts of humanism and coexistence and secularism and urbane cosmopolitanism and diversity were notions introduced to an otherwise obscurantist, culturally rigid Middle East by the Maronites, other Christians as well, but Maronites primarily, peoples traditionally intimately acquainted with and invested in European Judeo-Christian Enlightenment values. But this Maronite openness to the world around it ought not be conflated with nihilism or abnegation of self or homeland or communal history or Lebanon. I would say yes to universal ecumenism and the accommodation of multiple identities, but not at the expense, not at the cost of self effacement and abandonment of one's history and memory. And yes, I would say a resounding yes to the Maronites, glorifying Lebanon as they see it, as they've maintained it, as they've safeguarded it in their national history. Indeed, Lebanon, or rather Mount Lebanon, is the cradle of Maronites' national conception of themselves, of their selfhood. And the Maronites, the Christianized autochthonous inhabitants of pagan and Jewish historical Lebanon, have constructed their national mythology on the very idea of there being the Near East's last remaining rampart of Christendom, an impregnable bulwark standing sentry in defiance of an advancing, triumphant, conquering Islam. There ought to be no shame in admitting that historical reality. Later on, more recent historical elements claiming Maronite filiation to the impivot mariners of classical antiquity, the Phoenicians, valiantly braving the furious seas in search of safe harbors. So the Phoenicians were later added, if you will, to complement the Maronites' pleasing self-image of hardened mountaineers, taming nature, quelling invaders, building a national hearth grounded in a millennial collective memory. One often neglects mention of the Muslim presence in Lebanon being the outcome of centuries-long colonial penetrations into the Near East. In Near East as a millennial Arameo-Canaanite Greco-Roman preserve of the Byzantine universe, a Judeo-Christian universe, which in the 7th century Muslim imperial project, which was intruded upon during the 7th century, and this Muslim imperial project, if you will, disrupted and Islamized and later upended with the 1453 Ottoman conquest of Constantinople, upended this essentially Judeo-Christian preserve. Medievalist historian Guillaume has written extensively on this. I have a five-volume colossal work that I'm reading right now, titled Le Coran des Historiens, the Quran of the Historians. And in his work, Guillaume demonstrates the process of Islamization, whether it be in the Near East or in Europe, having been a slow, deliberate, centuries-long project that is still ongoing, an ongoing project in which Lebanon remains a major theater and a collision ground. And so when putative candidate to the French presidency, Éric Zemmour, speaks of the inexorable Lebanonization of France, he is drawing on a learned and nuanced reading of history, and in my view, a profound understanding of Lebanon and the root causes of Lebanon's troubles today. And so, let us not forget that in Lebanon, although having remained sparse for many centuries, the Muslim settlements were foisted on a fundamentally Judeo-Christian preserve, Semitic, Arameo-Hebraic in its soul, Greco-Roman in its values, its political organization, its cultural rituals, and its linguistic accretions, but that preserve was and remains to this day a part of the Judeo-Christian cultural and historical space. The very Canaanite Aramaic toponymy of Lebanon's towns and villages, down to the names of Lebanon's capital city, Beirut, and the attributes of its holy mountain, Tur Livnon, Ain Turo, Kodishe, among other names, all are overwhelmingly Canaanite and Aramaic, those place names in Lebanon, and all are evidence of the staying power of Lebanon's Canaanite, Aramaic, and Judeo-Christian foundations. Of course, this is not denying the composite nature of Lebanon today. It's not denying that Lebanon is a patchwork of varied cultures, ethnic and linguistic elements. Ernest Renan, in his Qu'est-ce qu'une nation, taught us that much. He taught us that nations are, by definition, a mélange of races, that purity of race is the preserve of horses, not people, and racial purity is an attribute actually of zoology, not human history, and not ethnology. But Renan also taught us that the coherence and the unity of a nation rests upon a body of common memories, assumptions, mythologies, and patrimonies, a historical canon, and a body of traditions, rituals, and inheritances, which a collective of peoples desires to preserve, to hallow, to transmit to future generations, and to perpetuate. And there's nothing wrong with that. So when the righteous advocates of suppressing Lebanese history, or mocking it, or melting Lebanon into its so-called Arab habitat, when they brandish their conscientious objection to the Maronites' history as a hoax, as it was called, let me suggest that everyone is entitled to their own hoaxes, and that the Maronites' myths of origin, falsified, fabricated, fanciful as they may be, are the Maronites' only truth, and are no more a fabrication than are the fairy tales of Arabs and Arab nationalists and the history that they foist upon us as fact. And lest one forget, let it be said once more that advocates of Arabism and Arab filiation in Lebanon and elsewhere in the Near East today are themselves the spawn of the allogenic settler colonialists of the 7th century Muslim conquest. That's my piece for today. Have a nice rest of your weekend. It's a Sunday here. Cheers.